Hi guys, I am back. So far in this lecture, we've talked about how to make ethical decisions. We've given you some horrible definitions of inappropriate ethical decisions. And now we're turning toward kind of how do you know that if you're going to do a garden variety study, how do you know that it's ethical? Well, if you work at any institution that is funded by the federal government and does research. And you might notice that I left that word institution very, very broad. It can be a nonprofit institution, an educational institution, a medical institution, all kinds of places receive federal funding. And if they're doing any research, they need to get approval from their institutional review board. So all of these institutions have to set up an institutional review board and then get approval from their institutional review board, their IRB, to make sure that their research is not only ethical in nature, but their procedures are correct and they're treating their participants in an ethical way. So why do we use an IRB? Why do we use an institutional review board? Well, our purpose is to protect and manage risk to human participants involved in research. It is an objective oversight committee. So the IRB at UH has several employees. They don't do research. Their whole job is to look over all of the studies done at UH to make sure that they adhere to ethical principles. And it's governed by federal regulations. So, as you might imagine, in today's very complex and bureaucratic world, the federal government has a lot to say about what standards and what documentation we use to make sure that our studies at our institution are ethical. And as I think I mentioned before, one of the reasons we do this, well, the main reason we do that is to do the right thing, to treat people ethically. But the penalty for not doing things is that we can get sued. We can get sued by research participants in the federal government, and it can cost universities an incredible amount of money. Almost as much, or maybe even more if it's a big study, than football players taking new cars and stuff from boosters. That was a joke, but it is those are both very serious ethical violations, and the university would pay for both. So what are the aims of the IRB? Well, they're made to promote the safety and well-being of human participants, to ensure adherence to the ethical values of principles underlying research. So, like I just said, they want to make sure people are safe. They want to make sure that the research stands for something greater, ethically wise, to ensure that only ethical and scientifically valid research is implemented. And this is important because sometimes the IRB will take a look at your research procedures and say, this isn't even a well designed study. You haven't even controlled for any confounding variables or anything else. Your research isn't worth doing. It isn't worth wasting these people's time. Go fix your procedure and then come back to us. And that makes sense. I mean, they want to make sure that your work is scientifically valid because that's an ethical use of participants' time. And then also, and I hope you're thinking of the Tuskegee study when I talk about this, it's to allay or appease concerns by the general public about the responsible conduct of research. That's a problem of science as a whole. So part of the IRB's job is to make sure that science is represented responsibly and fairly with the general public. So basically, what the IRB does, all told, is use risk management principles to decide if the research is worth doing. And so that's also called beneficence. And risk management principles balance the probability of risk with the magnitude of risk. And so, what we mean by the probability of risk is just like it sounds like, how likely is that risk to occur? It can be totally unlikely, um, I think I gave you that example about the gentleman with PTSD, and he saw blood on the paper. That's low risk. He probably did not see blood on the paper, and it's probably not high probability that very many of the people taking a test would see blood on the paper. So that's a low probability of risk. Then the other axis is the magnitude of risk, and that's how great the risk could be. So for this gentleman, seeing the blood on the paper, it's bad, and but at the very worst it would provoke a PTSD attack. So, and if the researcher had made sure there were professionals available to counsel him, I would say that might be an acceptable risk. But some studies, and as we'll talk about, some drug studies and stuff, if that risk is death, even if there's a low probability, we might not accept it. So that line that you see, this curving line in between the blue and the yellow part of this graph is actually kind of a line that, theoretical line that people use, that the IRB would use to decide if the risk of the study is worth performing it. And so, as you can see, the studies with low probability and low magnitude, that big area right here, oops, it's talking to me, is for my next example, this big area, this big blue area flowing out from the place on the slide that says low, low, that's going to happen. That's okay by the IRB. But things that are low probability but super high magnitude, probably not going to happen. Not a good idea. Or things that are low magnitude but very high probability, still might not be a good idea. So I've given some examples here of ideas that fall into each of these quadrants. Okay, walking to class, there's a low probability that that's risky, and there's a low magnitude of risk. Probably the worst thing that's going to happen to you walking to class is that you might trip and fall. We've all done it, or dropped our books or whatever. It's embarrassing. It's not good, but it's not going to kill you. So that's an activity that's low probability and low magnitude, or an experiment that involved that would be low probability and low magnitude. Now, staying up late, those of us that have stayed up all night to get work done, or to write papers, or to study for tests, know that there's like a 99.9, maybe 150. There can't be 150% chance, but there's a super high chance that you're going to feel horrible when you stay up late to study for a test. But the magnitude of risk, staying up late, you feel horrible. It's not going to kill you. You'll feel fine the next day. So it's a fairly low magnitude of risk. I mean, I hope you don't. Well, yeah, just in general, staying up late, as long as you're not doing any activity where it would be dangerous to fall asleep. So staying up late is something, there's a high magnitude of risk, it's pretty guaranteed you're going to feel terrible. There's a high probability of that risk, but the magnitude of that risk is low. Now here in this other corner, we've got drunk driving. Drunk driving is something that there's a low probability of risk. I really hate to put it this way, but I think all of us have known uncles or even aunties or friends who have done some pretty dumb, that have been stupid and driven drunk one time or another, and nothing has happened. Right? So there's a pretty low probability of risk that's going to happen when you're drunk driving. I mean, that something bad is going to happen. But what can happen, killing somebody, killing yourself, destroying lives, that's the magnitude that can happen with drunk driving. So that is something that is got a really low probability, but super high magnitude. So I would recommend not doing it because the consequences, the magnitude of that risk are just not worth it. And then sitting in the electric chair, if you're sitting in the electric chair, that's something that's a high probability of risk. If you're a criminal and you're sitting in the electric chair, somebody's going to press that button, and a high probability of um, a high magnitude of risk. So don't do it. And a research, I can guarantee you, well, there's not very many things in life we can guarantee, but I can guarantee you in your lifetime, you will never see a research study where they have non-volunteer participants sit in the electric chair. It's not going to happen because the IRB would not approve it. So the IRB approves things in the blue area. So just to give you an example, the acceptable risk goes from low to high. The magnitude of risk goes from low to high. Low is, meh. High is death. So before we leave, I'm going to leave you with a couple of definitions. I know it's kind of ridiculous to have some definitions at the end of a lecture, but because of at the beginning, that's when you usually have them. But in this case, they're kind of a nice way to give you an example of how to tie everything together, how the ethical principles that we've talked about actually work in the real world to prevent those unethical research that is unethical and harmful to certain people or populations. So an IRB, as I've said a million times, is an institutional review board, but here you have it in writing. It's a committee that screens proposals for research using human participants for adherence to ethical standards. The CHS is the Committee for Human Subjects. The official name of the IRB for the UH system is the Committee on Human Studies. I'm not sure. I know Kaiser has one. I know Straub has one. I'm not sure what their names are, but they do the same thing. General is IRB, more specific is CHS. And you can find out about the UHIRB just looking at that web address or Googling IRB UH Manoa. You can find out a lot of things. Definitions: a human subject is a living individual about whom a researcher, whether professional or student, obtains data through intervention or interaction, or obtains identifiable private information about them. So you think, well, yeah, of course, a human, yeah, that's what a human subject is. But I want you to think about what it doesn't include. It doesn't include non-identifiable information. So if you get a data set that's already been de-identified, that's already removed every single piece of identifying information from it, you can use that, and you're not technically doing research with human subjects. So you still have to file a short form with the IRB, but you don't have to get the prolonged approval. Also, notice that it says private information. So if you wanted to do a study, let's say you wanted to do a content analysis of recordings of speeches given by presidents, you would not technically have to obtain an IRB on that, because even though a president is a human, I mean, we hope so, unless the weird alien conspiracy movies are true, even though a participant is a politician is a human, if the information is publicly out there, you don't have to, that person is not technically a human subject, and you don't have to obtain a formal IRB approval. Although, as with the disidentifiable information, you still file a short form with the IRB letting them know that you are doing this type of research at the institution. Now, informed consent, which is something we've also talked a lot about, here's a formal definition. It's the process by which a person voluntarily agrees to participate in research based on adequate knowledge and understanding of a research project. So knowledge is important because we let them know the parts that are relevant to them, and then understanding. That kind of speaks to some other ethical research that I didn't talk about, where in the olden days, back about a century ago in this country even, they used to do research on mentally ill people. that's not okay because people don't understand research, so they cannot consent because they don't understand. Even if you give them knowledge, they don't understand it. And then again, it also goes back to what I said about children. Children you have to present it to children in a way that they can understand it. So that's informed consent. They have to give consent, but you also have to make sure that they are informed of what they can, and informed includes both knowledge and understanding. Deception, yeah, and that's probably what you were thinking about next. You're going, well, what happens if, I've read about research, like if you took a beginning psych class, about the Milgram experience, where they told people that there was a person in the other room that they were going to shock. There's no person in the other room, but it was really important that the participants thought that. So in that case, the researchers used deception. And that's a research technique in which participants are misinformed about the true nature and purpose of a study. Or in real language, they actually lie to these participants. And it, however, is ethical if the researcher, number one, can demonstrate that the important results cannot be obtained in other way. So it's ethical if the researcher says, yeah, this is so important to science and what we know about human nature that we cannot obtain these results in any other way. And then the second way that makes it ethical is that we would debrief participants. We would give them a session after the experiment in which participants are informed of any deception used and reasons for the deception. And that's so they don't feel foolish, so they trust research. Especially in the Milgram case, somebody who's led to believe that they actually shock someone severely or to death, at the end of a study, they would need to know that they didn't do it. That's really important, not only to not look foolish, but to be able to live with oneself after the study. So finally, a couple of last definitions that make some of the other rest of this lecture make sense is voluntary participation requires that people not be coerced into participating in research. And that goes anything from the funding of the study. From not doing studies on prisoners, they can't help it. Prisoners are mentally ill people. There's still people that want to do research with prison populations, and the IRB doesn't prevent it, but it really, really is strict on that. And prisoners have to be given the choice to participate and not to participate. They can't be coerced. But also in the sense that you can't pay people a whole bunch of money to be in your research, because that can be harmful to them. Because of that huge amount of money or whatever, they might do things that they would not normally do. So an example of this, it's kind of funny, but I have this one friend who, he was a anatomist, a PhD level anatomist, super crazy guy. And he was really, really poor when he was in graduate school. So he went to graduate school at a big university with a medical school. And there was a researcher there who was doing research on spine fluid. And they would give someone $1,000 if they'd get a spinal tap done. And I don't know if you've experienced a spinal tap. I hope you haven't, but you may have heard that it's crazy painful, because there are a lot of nerves in your spine, and so in able to get that cerebrospinal fluid out of your spine, they call it a tap because it's like a maple tree. You stick the needle in, and the maple sap comes out of the tree. You stick the knob in, and the maple sap comes out of the tree. You stick the conduit in, and the cerebrospinal fluid comes out of the spine in a crazy painful way. But this guy used to do it every 3 months because he was poor and he needed the money. So in that case, it was actually not really voluntary participation, because he needed that money to live as a grad student. So when you think about voluntary, make sure you consider all different ways of voluntary. And then again, you remember anonymity versus confidentiality. That's an ethical issue that we talked about a lot. Anonymous is if you don't know who the participants are. Confidentiality is if you do know, but you have the ethical duty to keep their data confidential. And then the last is risk management. You want to balance the probability of risk with the magnitude of risk in deciding whether it is worth having human participants take place in your research. So this is the only lecture for as this ethical section, and for the rest of it you will be completing an online ethics certificate. So I'll send you, and that actually will count as a lecture, so that will count as your lecture participation. So all of everything how to do that will be posted up online, and your lab instructors or I will help you through. So have a great week. I'll